Okinawa, June 1945. The noon sun hammered the prison compound until the air seemed to ripple. Near the center of the yard, a squad of American soldiers fought with 2 olive ponchos and a mosquito net, tying the corners to rough stakes and tent poles, throwing up a flimsy green screen around a bare wooden table. Inside that curtain of fabric, a young Japanese woman lay on the table, panting in short, broken gasps. Her name was Aiko Fujimoto. Pain burned low in her belly, as if someone were twisting a knife behind her right hip. "Hold her steady," Lieutenant Nora Beck said. Staff Sergeant Daniel Reeves moved to the foot of the table. His hands were slick as he gripped Aiko's legs. Combat had taught him how to drag wounded men out of fire. It had not prepared him for this. Outside the ponchos, the women's compound had gone almost silent. Dozens of eyes stared at the swaying fabric. Then the sound came. A sharp, ripping sound, loud enough to cut through canvas and voices. Reeves had grabbed the folded layers of Aiko's kimono and obi and torn them open in one heavy pull. Several women cried out at once, "What are you doing to her?" An older prisoner shouted in rough English, "Back!" A guard snapped, "Stay back from the medical area." Inside the screen, Aiko's chest heaved. She tried to lift her head, panic flaring, but a hand pressed gently to her shoulder and held her down. "Fujimoto-san," a quiet voice said in Japanese. It was Kenji, the camp interpreter. He crouched near her head. "Listen to me. They are trying to save you. Do not fight. Breathe. In and out. Stay still." Aiko fixed her gaze on him, on the one familiar sound in a storm of foreign orders. She felt something cold touch her lower back, then a deep pressure as the spinal needle slid between her bones. Numbness began to creep down her hips and thighs, but the pressure in her belly did not vanish. It only grew heavier. Lieutenant Charles Whitman leaned over her, gloved and gowned, jaw clenched. "We do this now," he said. "No ether, no morphine, just the spinal. We wait. She dies." Near the poncho opening, a young private hovered with a camera hanging from his neck. Anthony Delgado's fingers twitched on the leather strap. "Sir," he whispered, "do I really have to take pictures of this?" "That is Captain Hale's order," Whitman said. "If anyone accuses us of abuse, those negatives are the only thing that clears us. Document everything." Delgado swallowed. He lifted the camera, framed the scene with shaking hands, and pressed the shutter. The flash burst white against the canvas. Outside, women flinched as light leaked through the seams. To them, it looked like proof that something terrible was happening behind the screen. To the people inside, it was simply the sound of film catching a moment no one would believe without evidence. Aiko bit down on the folded cloth Beck had placed between her teeth. Kenji murmured to her without stopping. Reeves tightened his grip as her body jolted with each spike of pain. 2 days earlier, none of them had known her name. 2 days earlier, Aiko sat in the thin strip of shade behind her canvas tent, knees drawn up, arms wrapped around them. The sun was lower then, but the heat still pressed down. She was afraid. The ache in her belly had started the night before. At first, she thought it was hunger. Then she ate the thin bowl of rice the Americans gave them, and the pain did not fade. It clung to her, a small, hard knot near her navel. By morning, it had moved lower and to the right. She pressed her palm there now, fingers carefully exploring the tender spot. When she let go, the pain stabbed sharper, then settled into a steady throb. She knew these signs. In the field hospital before the Americans came, she had helped hold down soldiers while the surgeon cut into their bellies to remove an inflamed appendix. Early, they lived. Late, they died choking on infection. In the hospital, there had been choices. This man lives, that one cannot be saved. There had been beds, tools, trained hands. Here there was only dust, tents, and a fence. Across the yard, she could see the low wooden building where the Americans kept their own wounded and their supplies. If she closed her eyes, she could almost smell antiseptic beneath the sweat and rot. Appendix, she whispered in halting English, testing the foreign word. Cut. Need cut. No one answered. Around her, the camp moved in slow, resigned patterns, and the knot of pain inside her belly tightened another turn. The pain arrived quietly at first, just a dull pressure under Aiko Fujimoto's ribs as she tried to sleep on the thin blanket inside her tent. She had felt worse in the field hospital during the final weeks on Okinawa, when casualties poured in faster than beds could be cleared. So she ignored it, curled on her side, and whispered a short prayer that morning light would ease it. Morning came, but the pain stayed. By midday, it had settled sharply into the lower right of her abdomen, pulsing with every step. Aiko tried to move carefully, keeping her posture straight so no one would notice the way her breath caught. She didn't want attention. Not from the guards, not from the women around her, not from anyone. She had lost everything already, her hospital, her colleagues, the last sense of purpose she had clung to. She didn't want to appear weak on top of it. But as she sat in the thin line of shade behind her tent, the pressure changed. It twisted, sharpened, then radiated outward like ripples of fire spreading through her belly. Aiko gripped the ground until her fingers ached. She knew what this was. Appendicitis. Early stage yesterday. Now dangerous. She had watched soldiers die from it, their abdomens rigid, their skin gray, their breath short and shallow as infection overtook them. Without surgery, the end came quickly. She pressed her palm to the spot again. When she released the pressure, a sharp burst shot through her belly, stealing her breath. Rebound tenderness. Exactly what she feared. She needed a doctor. Someone who understood the urgency. Someone who wouldn't dismiss her as another prisoner with a stomachache. Aiko pushed herself upright and walked toward the fence where 2 American guards stood. The sun beat across her back. Each step jarred her abdomen, stabbing deeper. When she reached the gate, she bowed slightly, habit more than respect. Please, she whispered in halting English. Doctor. Hurt. She touched her abdomen. Appendix. Bad. The younger guard frowned. What's she saying? The older shrugged. Stomach trouble. They all got something to complain about. Aiko shook her head desperately. Pain. 2-day. Worse. The guards exchanged a look, annoyed, impatient. The older one finally raised his hand, palm out. Back to your area. Now. The dismissal hit harder than the pain. Aiko bowed again out of instinct and stepped back. As she turned, her vision wavered and dark spots floated across her sight. She caught herself on a tent pole before she fell. No one came to help. No one noticed. No one understood her words. She returned to her tent, sat, and curled forward until her forehead touched her knees. A strange coldness crept across her skin despite the heat. If the appendix ruptured, she would die long before anyone realized she wasn't simply resting. She closed her eyes and breathed through the pain, counting to 10, then again, then again. Across the yard, Lieutenant Nora Beck rinsed her hands in a warm basin outside the medical hut. The morning had been busy heat stroke, a twisted ankle, a Marine with a rash from sleeping in damp clothes. Nothing unusual. But as she shook the water from her fingers, a movement in the women's compound caught her attention. A woman slender, pale, moved between the tents with a strange, stiff gait. Beck narrowed her eyes. The woman paused, bent forward slightly, and pressed a hand to her right side. Beck had seen that posture dozens of times. It was always the same. The protective hand, the careful steps, the sudden stillness before the next wave of pain. Appendicitis. Damn, Beck muttered. She grabbed her canteen and crossed the yard. The guards at the gate straightened when they saw her approach. She didn't wait for permission. When she reached the woman, she slowed her pace, softened her voice. Hey, Beck said gently. You okay? The Japanese woman lifted her head. Sweat clung to her temples. Her breaths were shallow and uneven. "Pain," she whispered. "Today." Beck knelt to look her in the eyes. "Here?" she asked, touching her own right side. The woman nodded once. "Aiko," she added after a beat. "Aiko Fujimoto." "Aiko," Beck repeated. "I think you need a doctor. We're going to the medical hut." Aiko didn't resist. As Beck took her arm, she couldn't. Her legs trembled beneath her weight. Halfway across the yard, the pain struck like a blade. Aiko gasped and buckled forward. Beck caught her. "Easy. I've got you. Stay with me." Aiko tried to breathe, but her body felt heavy, sinking. A chill washed over her. Her vision narrowed, then dimmed. She collapsed. "Stretcher!" Beck shouted. "Move!" 2 soldiers sprinted toward them, lifting Aiko within seconds. Beck ran beside them toward the medical hut, heart racing. But when they reached the doorway, a tall figure stepped into their path. Captain Hale. His posture was rigid, hands clasped behind his back, expression unreadable. "Nurse," he said, voice flat, "why is a prisoner being brought into the medical building without approval?" "Sir," Beck said, forcing her voice to stay calm, "she may have acute appendicitis. If it ruptures, our supplies are not for enemy civilians," Hale cut in. "You know the regulations." "Sir, if she dies, the entire women's compound could panic." And ethically, Hale lifted a hand sharply. "This decision," he said coldly, "is not yours." Behind him, Aiko lay unconscious, breaths quick and shallow. Inside her abdomen, the clock kept ticking. Aiko lay limp on the stretcher, her breath shallow and irregular. Beck held her wrist, counting the frantic pulse beneath the skin. Reeves stood close behind, jaw tight, ready for whatever argument was about to explode. Captain Hale blocked the entrance to the medical hut, arms folded, expression carved from stone. "Nurse Beck," he said, "you will explain why a Japanese civilian is being moved toward restricted facilities." Beck kept her voice level. "Sir, she's presenting with acute abdominal symptoms, very likely late-stage appendicitis. She needs immediate evaluation." "She is not an American soldier," Hale replied. "Medical regulations are clear. We cannot turn this camp into a charity ward." Reeves stepped forward. "Sir, permission." "Granted," Hale said without patience. "If she dies inside the women's section," Reeves said, "it'll spark fear. Panic spreads faster than you can contain it." Hale gave him a hard, sideways look. "Security assessments are handled by command, not sergeants." Before the tension could sharpen further, Lieutenant Whitman arrived at a rapid stride, medical kit half open under his arm. He dropped to one knee beside Aiko, lifted an eyelid, pressed gently on her abdomen, then inhaled sharply. "Captain," Whitman said, "this is critical." Rigid abdomen. Rebound. Guarding. If we don't operate, she will almost certainly die before dawn. Hale stayed unmoved. "You know our supply situation. Any diversion must be justified." "I'm justifying it now," Whitman said. "This isn't elective. It's the most dangerous window of appendicitis. And what happens when the rest of the compound hears we're offering surgery to prisoners?" Hale countered. "Tomorrow they'll all claim stomach pain." "This isn't an exaggeration," Whitman insisted. "This is the difference between life and death." Beck added, "Sir, we've already lost time." Hale's eyes flashed. "Nurse, you are close to insubordination." Kenji, the interpreter, stepped forward almost timidly, but his voice didn't shake. "Captain, the women already know she's very sick. If she dies without attempt, they will believe Americans allowed it. Fear will grow. Fear creates unrest." Hale shot him a cold stare. "Interpreter, stay in your lane." "I am, sir," Kenji said softly. "I am interpreting their fear." The silence that followed was thick enough to suffocate. Reeves spoke carefully. Captain, may I remind you that the 7th Division currently has a war correspondent nearby? If anything resembling medical neglect. Hale's posture stiffened just a fraction. It was the only sign that the argument had landed somewhere he didn't want it to. Whitman seized the opening. We can operate without ether or morphine. A spinal block is enough. We only need clamps, sutures, boiled water, and hands to hold her steady. No extra supplies. Minimal risk to the camp. Hale exhaled a slow, irritated breath. If she dies on the table, then the result would have been the same without trying, Whitman said plainly. Aiko's breathing hitched, loud enough for all of them to hear. Something shifted in Hale's expression, not sympathy, but cold calculation of consequences and headlines. Finally, he spoke. Very well, but you will not use the medical hut. All three froze. Hale continued. This facility is for American wounded only. I will not risk contamination, nor set the precedent that prisoners receive full clinical access. Reeves felt a chill run down his arms. This decision meant the surgery would be brutal, exposed, and far less controlled. Where, sir? Whitman asked quietly. Hale pointed toward an open patch of ground about 20 yards away, near the center of the yard. There. Build your field. Use ponchos, screens, whatever you can find. The dirt? Beck whispered in disbelief. Sir, infection. Those are my terms, Hale cut in. Take them or leave them. Whitman swallowed hard. We'll take them. You have 1 hour, Hale said. Document everything. Every cut, every word. Sergeant Reeves' security falls on you. Any disturbance, any rumor, any impropriety, you answer for it. Yes, sir, Reeves said through clenched teeth. Hale pivoted and walked away, boots thudding across the hard earth. Whitman straightened, eyes shadowed. All right, he said. We work outside. Reeves nodded once. Beck exhaled shakily. Delgado appeared near the edge of the yard, clutching his camera. Captain Hale told me I'm supposed to photograph the whole procedure, he muttered. Whitman didn't even look at him. Then stay out of the sterile field and be prepared. Reeves turned to the guards. Set her down over there. Beck, start boiling water. Kenji, stay close for when she wakes. Beck moved quickly, unrolling ponchos to form ground cover. Reeves grabbed posts and rope, tying up a makeshift frame. More ponchos and a mosquito net became the walls of a narrow, wind-flapping shelter, exactly the claustrophobic space from the hook. The late sun bled across the yard as they worked. Dust floated in the beams. Aiko's breath wavered. Whitman snapped on his gloves. This is our operating room now. Reeves steadied himself. The hour had begun. The poncho walls snapped in the wind, casting shifting shadows over the rough wooden plank where Aiko lay. Beck knelt beside her, checking the pulse at her neck. Too fast. Heat radiated through the skin. The fever was climbing again. No time left. A gust of dust blew in. Reeves and 2 guards pulled the last poncho tight, securing the improvised shelter. The whole structure looked like it shouldn't stand, but it would have to. Beck forced her breath steady as she worked. She laid out the boiled cloths, then the instruments. Whitman's kit was missing half of what a real surgeon would need. That no longer mattered. A flicker of Aiko's face caught her eye drawn, pale, teeth clenched even in half-consciousness. Beck's mind pulled up the memory from 2 days earlier, quick and sharp like a cut. Aiko sitting by the wire fence, hands gripping her abdomen. Silent, rigid, no complaint, no plea. Beck crouched beside her that day, pressed gently. Aiko's flinch brief, involuntary, told her everything. Later that night, the limp had worsened. By dawn, she was leaning on the fence to stay upright. That morning, when she finally collapsed, Beck didn't think. She just called Reeves. The memory snapped away as Whitman ducked into the shelter. He glanced over Aiko once, his jaw tightening. rigid abdomen. More than before. Fever spiking, Beck replied. She kept her voice flat and factual. Kenji knelt beside Aiko, whispering to her in Japanese short, calm phrases meant to anchor her. She stirred at the familiar sound, but didn't wake. Reeves stepped in behind Whitman. Frames steady. No gaps. Good, Whitman said. Once we begin, nobody moves unless I say so. Delgado scrambled up beside the entrance, nervous hands adjusting his camera. The lenses rattled softly. Whitman eyed him for half a second. When I ask you to photograph, do it. Otherwise, stay clear. Yes, sir. Outside, Hale paced the perimeter with quick, clipped steps checking guards, pretending not to listen, pretending he hadn't just approved something that could blow up in his face if the war correspondent ever got wind of it. Beck placed another stack of boiled cloth within reach. Her breathing is shallow. Whitman nodded. She's close to rupture. Reeves braced his hands on the wooden support. Just say when. Kenji shifted closer to Aiko's ear. Stay still. They're here to help. Don't move. Aiko's breathing caught, then steadied slightly. Beck leaned in, holding her wrist, feeling the tremor under the skin. She didn't offer comfort, just presence, quiet and solid. Whitman snapped on the last glove. His voice remained low, but decisive. Spinal block first. She's going to jolt. Hold her. Beck positioned herself at Aiko's shoulders, Reeves at her legs. They shared no words, only the practiced readiness of people who had been forced to improvise too many times. Whitman checked the poncho seams once more. No tent. No clean light. No proper table. Just dirt, sweat, and whatever they could piece together in minutes. He crouched. Beck, prep. She handed him the sanitized needle and stepped into position, expression set. No fear. No hesitation. Outside, Hale stopped pacing for a moment, staring toward the shelter, toward the thing he had allowed, but still didn't entirely accept. Inside, Whitman placed a steady hand at the base of Aiko's spine. This is it, he said quietly. Once we start, there's no stopping. Reeves tightened his grip. Kenji murmured the next phrase softly. Delgado lifted his camera. Beck exhaled once, short and controlled. Whitman leaned forward to insert the needle. Wind pushed against the poncho walls, making the shelter breathe in and out like a living thing. Inside, everything was tight, silent, waiting. Whitman crouched behind Aiko, needle poised above her lower spine. Reeves and Beck braced for her reaction. Kenji steadied her with two hands and low Japanese murmurs. But before Whitman could press forward, hold it. Hale's voice cut through the heat like steel. Whitman froze, the needle half a breath from skin. Reeves exhaled sharply through his nose, fighting the urge to swear. Beck turned her head, jaw tight. Hale stepped under the poncho flap without asking permission, boots grinding into the dirt. His face was a controlled mask, anger, calculation, and something like fear buried under both. Before this goes any further, Hale said, voice low, I want every man in this camp to be clear about what is happening under my command. Whitman kept his tone controlled. We've been over this, Captain. She's hours from rupture. And I've been over this, Hale replied, eyes cold. We have limited antiseptics, limited dressings, and limited morphine, which I remind you is for our men. Using supplies on an enemy prisoner without a written justification is a court-martial waiting to happen. Beck spoke before she could stop herself. If her appendix bursts in the women's compound, we'll have 50 more patients. And the Red Cross inspection is in 3 days. Hale turned slightly toward her. I'm aware. Are you? Whitman said quietly, the needle still hovering. Because the difference between medical negligence and maintaining order is a signature that does not currently exist on any form. Hale stiffened. Beck thought for a moment he would pull rank and shut the entire procedure down out of pure spite. But instead, he reached inside his coat, pulled out a notepad, and flipped to a half-torn sheet. He scribbled something fast, hard, and angry. Then he tore out the page, folded it once, and shoved it into Whitman's chest. Whitman caught it with one hand. Hale's voice dropped even lower. This authorizes the operation, officially under disease control and preventing camp-wide outbreak. If someone asks why we didn't move her to the tent, I'll say you insisted on field isolation to reduce cross-contamination. Beck blinked at that. It was a lie, but a lie that protected all of them. Reeves frowned. Why the sudden change, sir? Hale didn't look at him. Because intelligence just informed me a war correspondent from the 96th Infantry is touring nearby positions. If one of his photographers wanders into this camp while a dead Japanese woman is being carried out. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The silence that followed felt heavy. Beck steadied herself. Then we should proceed. Whitman nodded, but Hale lifted a hand once more. One more thing, he said, looking at Delgado. If you're going to take photographs, they will be taken under my orders. Not Whitman's. Not Beck's. Mine. Delgado swallowed hard. Yes, sir. Hale stepped backward out of the shelter, but paused at the flap and added, without turning around. And nobody touches her clothing in any way that can be misinterpreted unless I witness it myself. A long, dangerous beat. Am I clear? Reeves and Whitman exchanged a grim glance. Reeves answered, Clear, sir. Hale finally left, boots crunching in the gravel, tension trailing him like smoke. Inside, air returned to lungs that had been held too long. Whitman straightened, refocusing. We're nearly out of time. Beck, hand me the needle again. Beck passed it, but her voice was quieter than before. Captain Hale will be watching. Whitman didn't look up. Good. He should watch. Reeves tightened his grip on Aiko's legs. Kenji whispered, Don't move. Don't fight. It's almost time. Delgado adjusted the camera, trying to stop his hands from shaking. Whitman positioned the needle, and he stopped again. The problem wasn't the spinal block. It was her clothing. The thick cotton of her multi-layered kimono was wrapped tight across the lower back, tied with a double-folded sash. If they didn't expose the lumbar spine cleanly, the spinal block would fail and she would thrash violently during the incision. Reeves saw it at the same moment Whitman did. Sir, we can't reach the insertion point. Whitman's jaw locked. We need access to her entire lower back, and we do not have shears long enough to cut through an obi. Beck's breath caught. Reeves looked toward the poncho entrance where Hale had disappeared. We can't take her inside. He'd shut us down the second we ask. Whitman's voice was calm, clinical, but urgent. Then we expose the area here. Fast. Reeves looked at Beck. Beck looked at Whitman. All three understood the implications instantly. This was the moment everything would turn. Whitman set his jaw. Reeves. On my command. Reeves nodded once, already bracing his hands against the fabric at Aiko's waist. Beck steadied Aiko's shoulders. Delgado lifted the camera. Kenji murmured to Aiko, not knowing what was about to happen. Whitman glanced toward the poncho flap, making sure Hale was within sight, but far enough not to intervene before it was too late. Then he said, quietly, Now. Wind battered the poncho walls, turning the cramped shelter into a trembling cocoon of heat, dust, and tension. Whitman crouched at Aiko's lower back, needle ready. Reeves stood braced at her waist, fists locked around the thick folds of the kimono. Beck held Aiko's shoulders. Kenji murmured quietly in Japanese, trying to anchor her. Ready, Whitman said. Reeves inhaled once deep, steady, and pulled. The cloth tore open with a sharp, violent rip. The sound cracked through the shelter like a breaking bone. The obi gave way first, then the thick layers beneath it. Aiko jerked instinctively, a strangled cry escaping her. Beck tightened her hold, absorbing the movement with her whole body. Outside, Hale's voice shot across the yard. What the hell was that? Reeves, report. Whitman didn't lift his head. Remain outside, Captain. This is necessary. Hale didn't enter, but his shadow darkened the poncho wall, watching, punishing, judging. Inside, Reeves tore again, hard, forcing the bound layers apart until the knot slipped loose. The back of Aiko's kimono sagged open, exposing enough skin for the spinal block. Delgado swallowed, lifted his camera. Photo, Whitman said. Only one. Click. The shutter slapped through the hot air. Aiko gasped, disoriented and half-conscious. Kenji steadied her cheek, whispering rapid reassurances. Don't move. They're saving you. Stay still. Whitman guided the needle forward. Aiko tensed, almost bucking off the plank. Beck bore down with both arms. Hold her steady. Reeves pinned her hips. Kenji held her shoulders, voice low and urgent. Whitman felt the intrathecal space by touch alone. Injection going in. The needle pierced, the plunger depressed. Aiko's muscles twitched hard, then softened. Her breath still shook, but the worst of the pain slipped away just enough for the surgery to begin. Whitman wiped sweat off his brow with his forearm. Block set. We begin. Beck positioned herself at his side with gauze ready. Reeves moved to the foot of the plank. Delgado hovered behind them, camera trembling in his grip. Whitman sterilized the incision site with the last splash of precious alcohol. The sharp scent cut through the dusty air. He picked up the scalpel. Aiko's breath hitched. Whitman glanced once toward the poncho flap, Hale still there, a rigid sentinel. Incision. The blade cut. Aiko flinched, a suppressed moan vibrating through her chest. The spinal block dulled sensation, but she felt enough to fear every movement. Beck leaned in, expression blank and steady, absorbing the tremors. Deeper, Whitman murmured. Retract. Reeves stepped forward with the improvised retractor, a mess kit handle hammered straight minutes earlier. Beck soaked pooling blood with boiled cloth. There was no suction. No light except a flashlight wedged between stones. Whitman worked fast. Not elegant, not clean, just fast enough to outrun death. The appendix surfaced swollen, mottled, bulging like a blister ready to burst. Another hour, Whitman muttered, and she'd be gone. He clamped the base. Delgado. Photo. Click. The camera captured the swollen appendix and the pair of American hands, saving a woman no one expected to live. Whitman severed the infected organ and dropped it into a metal tray. Beck irrigated the cavity with their last saline. Reeves wiped sweat from Whitman's forehead, hand steady despite the chaos. Minutes stretched into a slow, brutal crawl. Closing, Whitman finally said. He stitched quickly, ugly. Tight stitches meant only to survive infection and fever. When the last knot cinched, he sagged back slightly. Pulse? He asked. Beck checked. Fast, but steady. Kenji exhaled through his nose, closing his eyes for half a second. Reeves stepped back, shoulders slumping. Delgado lowered the camera. His hands would not stop shaking. Whitman looked at Aiko, pale, trembling, but alive. She made it through. If infection doesn't turn on us, she'll live. Beck covered Aiko's waist with the torn kimono scraps, not for modesty, but for warmth. Reeves wiped his hands on his trousers, breathing hard. Outside, Hale's boots crunched away from the poncho wall. No praise, no condemnation, just retreat. Inside the small makeshift shelter, dust floated in the hot air like ash suspended in stillness. Aiko lay unconscious but breathing. Beck checked her pulse again, more gently. Whitman wiped his instruments. We monitor her every hour. She'll climb into fever by tonight. Kenji rested a hand briefly near Aiko's shoulder, eyes lowered. Delgado scribbled into his notebook, recording everything before the truth slipped away into rumor. The wind slowed. The worst had passed. But the consequences, moral, political, and human, had only just begun. Night pressed down on the camp, thick and unmoving. Inside the poncho shelter, Aiko lay on the plank, fever building under her skin. A lantern burned low, barely holding back the dark. Beck checked her pulse every few minutes fast, but there, the stitches were intact. The breathing shallow but steady. Whitman returned twice in the first hour. He didn't speak much, just lifted the cloth, checked the wound, nodded, left. His exhaustion showed in the stiffness of his movements, but his focus remained sharp. Reeves stayed at the entrance, sitting on a crate like a guard posted over a battlefield casualty. He didn't look at Aiko often, but he didn't leave either. Kenji stayed beside her, whispering soft Japanese phrases meant to anchor her through the fever. Aiko drifted in and out of consciousness, her breaths uneven. Delgado hovered outside the poncho flap, writing fragments in his notebook. Sometimes he stopped mid-sentence, staring toward the shelter as if trying to make sense of what had happened under its canvas walls. Hours passed in slow circles. Near dawn, Aiko stirred. Her eyelids fluttered, and her fingers twitched toward her abdomen. Beck caught her hand before she pulled at the stitches. "Don't move," Beck said. "You're okay." Aiko blinked, eyes unfocused. The pain found her almost instantly. Her breath hitched, and she turned her head slightly toward the voice she recognized, Kenji. He leaned closer. "The surgery is over. Stay still." Aiko tried to speak, a faint rasp escaping. Beck held a canteen to her lips, letting a small trickle of water wet her tongue. It steadied her. She whispered a hoarse question. Beck frowned and looked to Kenji. "She wants to know," Kenji translated, "if she survived the night?" Beck nodded once. Kenji relayed the answer. Aiko closed her eyes briefly, a tremor running through her, not relief, just acknowledgement. Whitman stepped inside then, checking her pupils, her abdomen, her breathing. "She made it," he said plainly. "The next 48 hours decide the rest." Aiko stared at his face, not understanding the English but reading the seriousness. Beck asked, "Is she stable enough to move?" "She needs a cot," Whitman replied. "We can move her if we're careful." Reeves rose immediately. "I'll carry." "No," Whitman said. "Slow. Keep the spine straight. No jolts." They built a stretcher from ponchos and poles and lifted her Beck at the front, Reeves and Whitman supporting the sides. Kenji walked beside Aiko, whispering to calm her. Delgado followed, notebook pressed to his chest. The early sun cast long shadows across the camp as they crossed the yard. Prisoners paused their morning routines, staring in silence. No one spoke. The sight of American soldiers carrying a Japanese woman like a wounded comrade was something none of them were prepared for. Inside the medical tent, they lowered her onto a cot. Beck adjusted the blanket. Whitman made notes. Reeves stood back, awkward and unsure. Kenji checked her breathing. Aiko's eyes tracked him, trying to understand the new place. Whitman said, "Hydration every hour. Fever curve every 2. If she worsens tonight, we intervene again." He left without waiting for acknowledgement. Reeves hesitated near the cot. Beck noticed but didn't comment. Kenji listened as Aiko whispered something faint. He frowned, then said to Beck, "She wants to thank someone." "For what?" Beck asked. Kenji searched for the right phrasing. "For choosing to help her, when no one had to." Reeves shifted uncomfortably, his boots scraping the ground. Aiko's gaze drifted to him slow, searching. Kenji said, "She recognizes him." Reeves cleared his throat. "Tell her, I just followed orders." Kenji translated. Aiko listened, and something subtle changed in her face, not relief, not warmth. Recognition. The kind that acknowledged a truth she had seen with her own eyes. He could have refused. He didn't. She whispered a single trembling word. Arigato. Barely sound. Barely breath. Reeves froze. His expression didn't shift much, but something behind it tightened acceptance of a weight he didn't know how to carry. He gave one short nod, then stepped back, letting Beck take over. Beck checked the stitches again. The fever still burned, but Aiko's pulse was stronger. Kenji sat down beside the cot. Aiko's eyes fluttered closed, not in fear this time, but in exhausted trust. The tent settled into silence, the kind that comes when a life has stepped back from the edge but hasn't yet reached safety. For 2 days after the operation, Aiko drifted through fever and shallow breaths. Beck checked her every hour, counting pulse beats with 2 fingers pressed lightly to her neck. Whitman came and went in quick, quiet intervals, lifting the cloth on her abdomen, feeling for spreading heat, and marking temperature changes on a scrap sheet. Reeves lingered near the medical tent whenever he could, never stepping too close, never quite leaving either. Kenji stayed beside her cot from the moment she was moved, whispering soft reassurances she barely understood. On the second night, her fever broke. It happened without drama, no gasp or sudden movement, just a slow loosening of tension in her jaw and a steadier rhythm in her breathing. Beck felt the change first and wiped Aiko's forehead with a cloth, whispering, "Cool." When Whitman checked her an hour later, he nodded once. "She's through the worst." Aiko slept for nearly half a day. When she woke, she was still weak, but the fear in her eyes had softened. She could sip water without Beck holding her upright. She could whisper questions to Kenji. She could recognize the faces around her, even Reeves, who hovered awkwardly by the supply table pretending to sort equipment that didn't need sorting. Outside the medical tent, the war continued relentlessly until the morning of August 15th. A burst of static cracked through the camp loudspeakers. Every guard looked up. Prisoners paused mid-step. A radio operator shouted from the command post, "Japan has accepted the terms. The war is over." The news rippled through the camp in uneven waves. Some prisoners cried, some sat down silently in the dirt. Others stared straight ahead, as if unable to believe that years of hunger and fear could end with a single announcement. Aiko listened to the murmurs outside. Words like surrender, home, and family, spoken in Japanese from voices she hadn't heard in weeks. She turned to Kenji and whispered, "Is it true?" He nodded. "Hi. It's over." Within days, preparations for repatriation began. Lists were drawn, corrected, crossed out, corrected again. Trucks rumbled in and out of the camp carrying supplies, then carrying the first groups of civilians toward the coast. Aiko was strong enough to sit up now, even stand for short moments with Beck or Kenji supporting her. She watched the movements in the yard with a distant, unreadable gaze, Japanese families gathering bundles, American guards scanning rosters, officers barking orders in clipped tones. Beck visited her cot with a final medical form. "You're cleared to travel," she said. Aiko nodded, though her eyes drifted toward the poncho shelter where she had nearly died. Reeves appeared moments later carrying a fresh blanket. He didn't say much, just set it down near her feet, but the gesture landed heavier than words. Aiko bowed her head slightly. Reeves cleared his throat and pretended not to notice. Whitman examined her one last time, checking stitches, checking the wound, listening to her breathing. "You'll scar," he said, "but you'll live." She met his eyes and whispered the single word she had used since she first woke. "Arigato." Whitman didn't understand the language, but he understood the meaning. On the morning of her release, Aiko stepped out of the medical tent for the first time in weeks. The sun was sharp and almost painful after so many days under canvas. Repatriation trucks lined the yard. Guards shouted names in rough accents. Prisoners responded with cautious hope. Aiko walked slowly with Beck on one side and Kenji on the other. Reeves stood beside the truck, pretending to check the straps. Kenji translated Aiko's parting words. "She says she will remember what you did." Reeves nodded once. Tell her to take it slow climbing in. Aiko smiled, tired, small, but real, and climbed aboard. The engine growled, and the truck rolled forward. Beck watched it disappear down the dirt road. Reeves stood with arms crossed, staring at the dust cloud long after the others walked away. Whitman simply said, "She survived us. She'll survive whatever comes next," and returned to his duties. Months later, the camp was dismantled. The poncho shelter was burned. The medical tent folded and shipped. The logs filed away and buried in archives. The men went home, Beck to a naval hospital stateside, Whitman to Massachusetts, Reeves to Ohio. Kenji returned to a Japan changed beyond recognition. None of them spoke often about Okinawa. None expected to hear Aiko's name again. And none imagined that the story they had buried would surface decades later, carried by a single document and a single photograph waiting quietly in a government file. In 1978, 33 years after the war, a young historian named Laura Mendel walked into a basement room of the National Archives searching for material on battlefield medical ethics. She expected routine documents, supply complaints, infection reports, casualty graphs. Instead, she found a thin folder misfiled beneath a stack of shipping manifests. When she opened it, a single photograph slid out and landed on the table. The image froze her breath. A Japanese woman lay on a wooden plank beneath a poncho roof, surrounded by 3 American medical personnel. Her torn clothing exposed the rough reality of the operation, and the dust suspended in the air suggested heat, urgency, and fear. The expressions of the men and women attending her revealed exhaustion rather than cruelty. At the bottom of the folder, Laura discovered a written report signed by Private Henry Delgado, describing an emergency appendectomy performed on a female civilian POW in June 1945. The description matched the photo in every detail, including the tension with camp command, the scarcity of supplies, the spinal anesthesia, and the need to tear the patient's clothing when tools were unavailable. Laura reread the report several times. Something about it felt too human, too fragile, to remain buried in an archive. She traced the names listed in the document and began contacting each surviving member of the team. Her first interview was with Dr. Charles Whitman, then a retired surgeon living quietly in Massachusetts. When she placed the photograph before him, he stared for a long time without speaking. His voice was steady when he finally spoke, but his eyes carried the memory of the heat, the dust, and the weight of a life he had nearly lost on his table. He explained the conditions of the camp, the shortage of medicine, the risk of infection, and the conflict with Captain Hale. He did not dramatize the moment. He only reported what necessity demanded that day. From there, Laura traveled to Florida to meet the former captain. Hale was stern, rigid, and unwilling to discuss emotions. He allowed her to record him, but refused to entertain the word regret. When she asked if he wished he had acted differently, he replied, "I made the only decision the regulations allowed. If I had to do it over, I would have made it faster." His voice carried no apology, only the hardness of a man shaped by military doctrine and the fear of losing control during wartime. Beck proved harder to locate. After leaving the Navy, she had joined a volunteer medical mission overseas. When Laura reached her through a contact at a relief camp, Beck remembered the case instantly. Her description was precise: the tremors in the girl's legs during the spinal injection, the moment the fever broke, the way the girl whispered "arigato" after waking. Beck spoke with the tired honesty of someone who had treated too many patients across too many borders, but who had never forgotten the ones who hovered closest to death. Reeves required persuasion. He lived in Ohio, working on a small farm and avoiding conversations about his wartime service. When Laura visited, he remained quiet as she laid out the photograph and Delgado's report. He did not touch the image. He only studied it with the same stillness he once carried under fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "It looks worse than it was," he said. She answered gently, "The report explains why." Reeves nodded, not lifting his gaze from the photograph. Kenji's trail led to Japan, where he had become a translator after the war. He remembered the operation as a moment of impossible fear for the girl and impossible choices for the Americans. He recalled holding her hand so she wouldn't thrash when the needle touched her spine and telling her in Japanese to stay still because they were trying to save her life. His memories filled the gaps the American reports could not describe. Finding Aiko proved the longest search. Through old repatriation lists and medical registries, Laura eventually discovered that she was alive and practicing emergency medicine in Tokyo under the name Dr. Aiko Tanaka. When they met, Aiko studied the photograph with calm acceptance, as if revisiting a pain she had long folded away. She asked whether the others lived. Laura told her most of them did. A private reunion was arranged in San Francisco at Dr. Whitman's home. No press, no cameras, no audience, only the people bound by a moment under a poncho roof in 1945. When Aiko entered the room, silence settled. Reeves stood by the window, unsure of what to do. Beck straightened her posture. Whitman poured tea with careful hands. Delgado, now a professor, adjusted his glasses nervously. When Aiko bowed to Reeves, he bowed back, stiff and awkward. She clasped Whitman's hands, thanking him slowly in English. Beck offered a quiet nod. Delgado played a short cassette Hale had mailed. The captain's voice cracked through the speaker, offering no apology, only the same rigid sentence. I made the only decision the regulations allowed. When the tape ended, Aiko spoke softly, steadily sharing what she remembered, what she feared, and how she survived. No one asked forgiveness. No one gave it. They simply acknowledged the moment that had bound them, letting understanding settle where apology could not. In the years after the quiet reunion in San Francisco, the story did not disappear again. It moved slowly, carried by the people who had lived it, each in their own way. Dr. Whitman passed the photograph and Delgado's report to a colleague who specialized in wartime medical ethics. Beck shared fragments of the event during lectures for young nurses learning to work in crisis zones. Even Reeves, who rarely spoke of the war, kept a small copy of the image folded into a book on his shelf, though he never showed it to anyone. Aiko returned to Tokyo, continuing her work in emergency medicine, choosing not to speak publicly about the operation, but never denying it when asked. She carried the memory privately, like a scar under clothing present, but not defining her life. The turning point came in 1980, when an international medical symposium in Geneva prepared an exhibit about field surgery under extreme conditions. A curator requested archival images from the United States, and the forgotten photograph resurfaced. Several organizations contributed context, and for the first time, the operation beneath the poncho roof was presented not as an act of humiliation or punishment, but as a moment when individuals chose to save a life despite the war surrounding them. The photograph drew quiet crowds. It said more than a paragraph of doctrine could. Compassion could exist even when no one expected it to. Later that same year, an international health organization approved the installation of a small plaque on Okinawa, near the area where the medical camp once stood. No flags, no national symbols, no triumph. Only a simple line in English and Japanese. Here, in 1945, doctors and soldiers chose humanity over enmity. The wording was careful, neutral, and respectful of the complexities of memory on the island. Local officials agreed. Elder residents debated it quietly but did not oppose it. The plaque was placed at the edge of a clearing, shaded by trees that had grown tall since the war. Visitors rarely found it by accident, but those who did often stayed longer than expected, trying to understand how such a moment had happened amid the chaos. Aiko visited the site once, early in the morning before other travelers arrived. She stood still before the plaque for several minutes, letting the air settle around her. She placed her hand lightly against the stone, not in gratitude, not in reverence, but in acknowledgement. Then she left without taking a photograph. In the United States, Delgado, now a professor, began using the image during his lectures. He never dramatized it. He simply set the slide on the screen and let his students study it before giving context. At the end of each semester, he asked them one question: what would you have done in their place? He never offered an answer. He let the silence teach them. But the photograph found its most unexpected home years later, when a history teacher in California included it in a lesson about wartime choices. One afternoon, after the bell rang, she noticed a 14-year-old girl lingering near the projector. The girl stared at the image, the torn clothing, the fear, the determination on the faces of the medics. When she finally spoke, her voice was almost a whisper. "They didn't have to save her," she said. "But they did." The teacher nodded. "That's why we study it." The girl didn't move. She looked again, longer this time. "Does she live?" she asked. "Yes," the teacher answered. "She lived." The girl exhaled softly, as if that single fact allowed the world to make a little more sense. And the story, carried quietly from one generation to the next, continued its life not as a tale of war, but as a reminder of the rare and fragile moments when people choose to be more than the uniforms they wear.